internet, and welcome to my video about the year of 845. Now, why 845? Well, because I wanted to do basically two videos. I wanted to do a video about the sort of decline and fall, or at least the decline of the Carolingian Empire, and I wanted to do videos about the Viking raids of 845, and since those two can well be considered somewhat intertwined, I decided to say, screw it, and just basically make one video talking about both of those things. Now, I will one day probably make a video about the Carolingian Empire as such, because it's incredibly, relevant. I will probably perhaps make more about the siege of Paris at one point. I already mentioned it in a couple of videos. I will mention it here, but I might do more. At least I will definitely do something about the siege of Paris in 885, 886 by later Viking raiders. But yeah, right now, the year 845 and the decline of the Carolingian Empire, and as that coincided with two of the biggest Viking raids on continental Europe. So yeah, enjoy. In the year 845, the once incredibly mighty Carolingian Empire, a sort of Novo Roma, a new Rome stretching across the Western European world under Emperor Charlemagne, was in precipitous decline. The rule of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, had been a time of stagnation and to a certain degree decline, and when Louis died, the sons that he left behind, each ruling smaller parts of the empire, very quickly fell into civil war, which of course meant that they were focusing all their energy on trying to kill and conquer each other, rather than to keep the empire together or, do anything but preserve their own personal power. Now, as was custom within the Frankian realms already, it had been with the Merovingian dynasty a couple of centuries earlier, and definitely had become with the Carolingians. The custom was that as sons of the kings grew up, they would get sort of smaller areas of the king's overall domain to rule as, well, kings in their own right. So, for instance, Louis the Pious' eldest son, Lothair, had ruled certain areas in his own right for quite a while. And as his younger brothers Louis the German and Pepin grew up, they were also given various areas of the realm to, be the sovereigns of, namely parts of modern-day Germany and Aquitaine, a duchy in south of France. However, Louis's wife, Louis the Pious' wife, then died. He married again and had another son called Charles, the one we later would know as Charles the Bald. Louis wanted Charles to also have a domain of his own to rule, but the sons of his first marriage weren't all that keen on that particular situation, so there was a round of civil wars against the sons, who, after all now, ruling their own domains, had their own ways of getting resources and armies together. Well, they rebelled against their father and actually managed to imprison him for a while, until he got out, allied with one of his sons against the others, brought those sons under the heel, then turned on the first who allied. It was a mess. The last 5 years of Louis the Pious' rule was a mess of civil wars of the emperor against his sons, which, of course, only weakened the Carolingian Empire at a time where it was actually starting to come under some degree of pressure from a now revitalized Dano-Norwegian Viking warrior culture. However, in 840, as I said, Louis the Pious died, and his sons, as was tradition amongst the Frankian rulers, split the empire into three parts. Well, they didn't really. Lothair basically claimed the entire empire for his own and had himself crowned as emperor as the oldest son. However, his brothers did not agree and decided that a good idea would be to, continue the civil wars now only against their older brother rather than their father. And since they had more people than Lothar and a larger army, they managed to defeat him. So Lothar was basically sitting there. Then, of course, his idea was to ally with one brother against the other brothers, and so another fresh round of civil wars went on there, all again weakening the Carolingian Empire, as you can imagine. This lasted basically for about almost 2 years until the three main brothers, that means Lothar, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, signed a peace treaty called the Treaty of Verdun because, well, it was signed in the fortress city of Verdun. It basically split the empire into three whole parts. Namely, Lothar would receive the old Carolingian heartlands in the Benelux areas, the German Rhineland, and into northern Italy, which is in the map you see above Lotharingia, with his capital in the old imperial residency of Aachen. Louis the German would receive Eastern Francia, which is, of course, most of central Germany and parts of Bohemia. This is what would later develop into the Holy Roman Empire. And Charles the Bald would receive West Francia, which is, as you see in the map above, or would see in the map above if the picture hadn't just changed, what was basically modern-day France, or at least most of modern-day France. At the time, it didn't seem like this was going to be a sort of permanent solution, and I'm sure the brothers eventually were just waiting for a chance to kill their siblings and reunite the empire. This was, however, eventually to become a rather permanent situation. Pepin, the last brother, agreed to just remain as Duke of Aquitaine under the sovereignty of his brother Charles. In the overall video on the Carolingian Empire, I will eventually go into details about how the whole thing turned out and how it meant that we eventually developed into the modern-day nations we have, or at least into modern-day France and the Holy Roman Empire, which basically, in the end, took over all of those lands in a duality rather than a triple nation-state, as Lotharingia eventually basically vanish. But I'll get into that later. However, what it did mean, as you can imagine, was a severe weakening of coastal defenses as armies were being marched to and fro in order to, kill your brothers rather than watch for those bearded raiders from the North Sea who could, with their incredible naval superiority, appear almost anywhere. So these were the years of, in some ways, a Viking high point in continental Western Europe. Vikings came everywhere. Everyone in the north who wanted something basically took a trip down to France and brought back specialities, almost like today, except that unlike today, we didn't really pay for it back then. So it was more like, call 1-800-pillage me, and there would be some Vikings around to do a bit of plunder, burning, and raping. Of course, it's also worth mentioning here that not only did the civil wars weaken the coastal defenses and weaken the possibilities of resisting the Vikings, it also did it basically because the three brothers couldn't really, agree on any common defense, which meant that if the Vikings had plundered West Francia and then sailed off and just traded peacefully in Lotharingia, well, Lothar probably wasn't all that interested in kicking their asses because, after all, they had only annoyed his brother that he didn't particularly care for, as it were. So, in many ways, this really was a golden age for Vikings. So, let's go to the Northlands then and see how the situation was at the time where the French and the German and the Carolingians basically created a help yourself buffet for any piratical raider that wanted to take a little trip and get some gold and silver. Now, the Franks were at the same time a bit lucky and a bit unlucky at the state of affairs in the Nordics. In the most of the rule of Charlemagne, the Northmen had actually been his most direct opponents. Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony had basically, to a certain degree, been opposed, if not directly, then at least with support by the great Nordic king Siegfried and his successor Gottfried, and in fact, they had been so much of a threat that Charlemagne basically eventually had to gather his own entire imperial forces to march up to the northern border just to make sure that he wasn't invaded without any real sort of choice to invade himself. So, to a certain degree, the north was a great threat to the Carolingian Empire in its early days. However, at around the same time as Louis the Pious got on the throne, the north, particularly Denmark, which was at the time the ones who sort of really got involved with the continental Christian nations, thrown into a bit of a disarray because Gottfried died, and a guy called Harold Clack, who was a nephew of a former king, decided that he was just the guy to become king of Denmark. However, Gottfried's sons also believed that they were just the guys to become king of Denmark, so they had a fairly long and fairly prolonged civil war. Harold had the upper hand for a while, then the sons of Gottfried threw him out. Then Harold went down to Louis the Pious and declared that if Louis wanted to help install him as king of the Danes again, well, then he would stop various raiders and actually convert to Christianity. So he did, and Louis sent him home, and he said to the, sons of Gottfried that either you share power with me or, well, hell, the emperor will come up and ally with me, and together we will spank you. So they did, except for two of those sons of Gottfried who went out of the country into exile. There were 4, 5, or 6 sons of Gottfried. It's really hard to say because we don't really have independent names on them, except for the one called Harek, who I will return to later. However, Harold managed to annoy the Nordics, probably because they didn't really want a French or Frankish puppet king, so eventually the exiled sons of Gottfried came back. They allied with their brothers and kicked Harold out again. So he went down and got help from the emperor and returned, and there was another round of civil wars, but eventually Harold was kicked out for good and settled as the Count of Friesland as a vassal of Louis the Pious. This, of course, meant that power was now in the hands of the sons of Gottfried in Denmark, but those civil wars had, to a certain degree, weakened central authority in the Nordic countries, and also meant that a degree of, rebuilding was necessary. Now, the sons of Gottfried sort of died off over the years, until eventually only the one we know today as Harek, or Horik, or Erik, which is basically his name, was left as sole ruler of Denmark from probably around the mid-830s. Of course, when I say King of Denmark, I don't mean King of Denmark in a sort of later, yes, I rule everything kind of way. It was more like he was probably the most powerful ruler in the area, and quite a few other smaller local kings would have considered him their overlord rather than their sort of actual superior. They were kings in their own right. However, Harek was just sort of the over king of the kings in the Danish realms at the time, almost like, for instance, the High Kings of Tara in Ireland, if that makes sense to any of you. Now, Harek, either by natural inclination or by some worry about the power of the Carolingian Empire, was actually known as a fairly peaceful king. He utterly refused to lead the main army south to raid the Carolingian Empire. He tried to maintain peace with first Louis the Pious, and then for a while his sons. They were sending ambassadors back and forth. He was actually punishing various pirates that had done raids he hadn't approved of, and overall Harek was sort of known as I won't say a peace-loving king, but as one who was to a certain degree trying to appease and maintain good relations with the empire. However, as I said, he was not a total dictator, and that meant that a lot of all other smaller kings, while acknowledging him as their overlord, did not feel bound by his edicts necessarily. So a lot of other smaller kings decided, hey, okay, Harig isn't doing it, come to me, and I will go down and raid France, because that's always fun. And so the Viking raids increased actually over the years at this point, because while Harig didn't really want to bring a full war, he also couldn't stop any of his free and sovereign subjects from going out and doing, well, what they wanted. That was, after all, northern culture at the time. And this, of course, led to, as I said, as the Carolingian Empire weakened, a lot of, shall we call them, private Viking raids against, well, there were a lot in England, of course, at the same time, the Great Heathen Army that I've mentioned earlier, and something that definitely will get a video on its own one day, because that's very, very interesting. But there was a lot of private Viking raids against particularly eastern and western Francia. Not so much actually in what became Lotharingia, though of course even its northern coast got its share of piratical raiders. And so we come to the year 845 AD. Charles the Bald, king of Western Francia, is staring directly over the border at Lotharingia and his older brother, who is currently the official emperor, wondering when the hell can I have a go at him, while also trying to mobilize a certain degree of coastal defenses to prevent those annoying Northmen from pillaging and burning all his villages. Louis the German is at the same time staring stiffly over his western border at Lotharingia, wondering when the hell he could have a go at his brothers, while also, of course, making sure that his northern border is strongly reinforced, because he actually share a land border with those pesky Normans who have a idea of coming down and plundering and pillaging his villages. One thing Louis the German did do, however, was support the effort of Archbishop Ansgar of Bremen to proselytize amongst the Danes. Ansgar, who had been in the Nordic countries repeatedly, had actually been the sort of court priest of Harald Klak in his days, were determined to spread the word of the gospel to the heathen Northmen, and perhaps also through that to dampen their, piratical and martial spirit. So Louis the German, of course, supported this as a good Christian, and this meant that Ansgar sent plenty of priests and envoys into the Danish lands in order to spread the good words and denounce the old religion. This will come back to haunt him in a little bit. Enter Ragnar Lothbrok. I've already made a video about him, you should go watch that. But in 845 he took command, actually in late 844 probably, he took command of a group of Vikings that had harried the southern coast of England and the northern coast of Western Francia for a while, and had in fact even taken a short detour down to Spain to see if plundering the Andalusians and the Asturias was any fun. Gathering all together a force of about 120 ships with approximately, it is reckoned today, 5,000 Viking warriors aboard. Probably a bit more, actually, as I count how long ship would be equipped. But on the other hand, most of these had been on a long year-long raid anyway, so 5,000 might be fine. He decided to sail up the Seine and, well, conquer whatever he could, or at least plunder whatever he could, particularly the capital of Western Francia at the time, namely Paris, where Charles the Bald actually had his seat. Though he wasn't there very much, because he was usually over with his army on his eastern borders staring at Lotharingia, as I've mentioned earlier. Now, Ragnar and his Vikings sailed up the Seine, plundering and pillaging as they came, burning and sacking the town of Rouen, which is actually somewhat ironic, since what is probably a nephew of Ragnar would later become the Count of Rouen, and his descendants would eventually become the Counts of Normandy and later the Dukes of Normandy. But they plundered Rouen and they sacked the countryside on both sides of the Seine as they slowly sailed up it in their barks. Charles the Bald finally decided that this could no longer go on, so he gathered an army and marched to intercept the Vikings. He found a decent place he felt to stop them and divided his army into two parts, so either of them could guard, or so they could guard both sides of the riverbank, so the Vikings couldn't just get inland and plunder as they pleased. Now, strategically, this was probably a fairly decent idea. Tactically, it proved to be an utter disaster. The Vikings, enjoying strong naval superiority, even if they were only on a river and not actually out at sea, landed on a small island in the Seine between the two armies, and to mock the king and his forces, hung various Frankish prisoners they had taken during their time plundering northwestern France. This, of course, annoyed the king so much that he had his men go into battle positions, at which time the Vikings all made landfall on the side of the river the king wasn't on, and utterly defeated, destroyed, and scattered his army division over there. This, of course, suddenly meant that once again, one side of the Seine was completely open for more raids, and Charles, rather broken over this utter defeat, retreated back towards Paris and in fact through the city and further east without further hindering the Vikings, who arrived in Paris a little bit later and began the siege. Paris at the time consisted basically on a fortified town on the Ile des Cités with a few fortresses and outbuildings on either side of the Seine. And when I say siege, it wasn't actually that much of a siege. Now, Paris was besieged, no doubt about it, but unlike the Great Siege of 885, 40 years later, under one of Ragnar's sons, the Parisians this time more or less basically surrendered. They didn't want the horrors of a true siege. They didn't want the horrors of their town being sacked, burned, and plundered. And as they were incredibly demoralized by the defeat of the king's army and his determination to abandon them to the Viking raiders, they more or less, after a very token resistance, opened their city gates and allowed the French in to possess the city. The Vikings in to possess the city. Oddly enough, Ragnar and his forces didn't actually sack Paris. They sat on the city, plundering again in the countryside and probably taking tons and tons of treasures from Paris. There is at least some indications that they were doing a sort of anti-Christian campaigns of plundering and destroying churches. They didn't really, again, decide to burn or truly pillage the city, and this allowed Charles to come up with an idea, because he realized that he simply didn't have the forces to force the Vikings out, but he did resort to the one thing that had basically always sort of working with the Vikings, namely, he bribed them. He basically appeared to Ragnar, well, he didn't, but he made a deal with Ragnar saying, if I pay you about 700 pounds of gold and silver, will you sail back home and leave me and my country alone? And Ragnar, probably at this time aware that his position was weakening as his army had gotten a plague-like disease that were diminishing its ranks, and also realizing that they were actually quite far inland and needed to get back out again without necessarily having to fight all the way and all of them die, decided to accept the agreement. He gathered up everything he had plundered and he sailed for home. Now, as I mentioned in the video I did on Ragnar, according to eyewitness accounts from a certain Eastern Frankian envoy to King Harik's court at the time in Denmark, Ragnar soon appeared in Denmark, bragging of his huge amounts of gold, and then apparently dying from the plague that he and his men had brought from Paris, at which point King Harik basically had every surviving member of the expedition he could lay his hands on executed, since they were obviously cursed and deceased. However, that is for another thing. The point is, the Vikings had sailed up the Seine from the coast, plundering all the way, scattered the primary Frankian army, and humiliated King Charles, whose authority was, of course, at this particular point collapsing. It took him another 10-15 years basically to get back to being a strong centralized monarch of Western Francia. That was the first Viking raid of Paris. Of course, the Viking raids continued on the coastlines, but it also probably gave them the idea that Paris was a good place to sort of have a scrap with the French, which led to the Great Siege of 885 that I shall return to in another video. At the same time, however, in Denmark, King Harik was becoming a tiny bit annoyed. You see, ever since he took over sole rule of the kingdom, he had tried a conciliatory politic towards the empire. He had punished various raiders that did things he didn't approve of against the Franks. He had, in fact, even directly apologized to Louis the Pious over some unlicensed pirates, if you can call them that, plundering the Frisian coast back in 836. And here he was. He had maintained this peace basically in order to, how to put it, restore Danish power to a degree where they could again be a regional superpower, contending with the Carolingian Empire without the risk of being overrun by the Carolingian armies. Now, the Carolingian Empire was stagnating, splitting, and declining, and yet, at the same time, here were all these private Viking raiders going out, getting fame, glory, and money, and becoming, through their fame, glory, and money, rivals to Harik's overlordship over the Danes. As if that wasn't enough, the Eastern Frankians, who he shared a border with, continued sending these pesky and annoying priests up to trying to convert his people and tell them and him that all their, ancient traditions and ancestor-inspired, ways of doing things were terribly wrong, and they should listen to this dude who had basically managed only to get himself crucified 800 years prior. While asking to kindly stop doing that, Louis the Pious second son, who ruled Eastern Francia, had basically not particularly treated Harik with any supreme degree of respect. All of these things meant that Harik basically decided, no, I'm getting tired of this shit, and so he declared a full sea leathing. A sea leathing is the sort of Nordic gathering of all forces. It's every village had a sort of, well, you have to equip this ship with so and so many warriors, etc., etc. And Harik was getting pissed enough to actually declare one of those. Overall, they might have been declared only about 50 times, if even that, throughout the entire history of the Nordic Viking era. So, as you can imagine, this was not something that happened a lot, but he did. And with 300 ships and approximately 20 to 30,000 men, he decided to teach those uppity Germans a little lesson. At the same time, in the same year, 845, as Ragnar was harrying northwestern France and approaching Paris, Harik sailed his far larger fleet down into German waters and arrived at the archbishopric town of Bremen. And, well, the Bremens probably didn't like what they saw, and they really didn't like it when Harik immediately ordered his army on the attack, sacking the city well, driving out Archbishop Ansgar basically with only the clothes he was wearing at any given time, as he utterly plundered, burned, pillaged, and destroyed the town. As there was no sort of real resistance, and as Harik was, as I mentioned, a mite bit annoyed at the time, he immediately sailed further up Germany and arrived at the great town of Hamburg, the largest city in northern Germany at the time, and began to besiege it. Unlike the sort of hapless at the time Charles the Bald of Western Francia, who at least attempted to stop Ragnar and his forces, Louis the German don't really seem to have done anything much. If he did, it's not really recorded anywhere. He might have sent certain forces to oppose the Viking, but in that case they were actually quite easily wiped out, as nothing is really heard about it in yearbooks or otherwise. And having arrived at Hamburg, Harig then, as I said, decided to, well, we already besieged this, let's treat it in the way that it should be treated by decent Vikings. So Hamburg, the largest city of northern Germany, was basically plundered, pillaged, destroyed, burned, sacked, and utterly oppressed in a week-long orgy of blood and death. Like I said, he might have been a mite bit annoyed. This, as you can imagine, did not really do anything good for Louis the German's particular, reputation or standing with his particular people, as he basically had allowed his entire northern part of his realm to be taken and burned and pillaged and sacked by this heathen bearded dude from up north that he had otherwise treated with a certain degree of disrespect because he seemed to be a peaceful and friendly kind of sort. Rather big miscalculation. Again, I shall return to in the Carolingian videos to why this might in fact have decided in the end why it was Charles the Bald who finally became the last sort of real Carolingian emperor rather than Louis the German. However, Harig, obviously believing that he had made his point and possibly hearing that Ragnar was on his way back and wanted to be home to meet him, decided to sail home and reinstall himself in Denmark. He did, and in fact he maintained peace as such with the empire again from this point until his own death 9 years later, except of course the various private Viking raids that was going on that he couldn't, or by this point perhaps wouldn't stop. So much for the Vikings. However, we must return to Western Francia and the poor Charles the Bald for a little while, because later this year, this had basically all taken place in the spring. Later that year, the Dukes of Brittany decided that no, Charles the Bald wasn't one to actually remain king over us because he was obviously incompetent and we can happily rule ourselves. So the local Count de Van decided to, I will be just the guy to rule Brittany as a kingdom, and he decided to rebel against Charles the Bald, and in the Battle of Berlon in November, he defeated the king again, not having a good year, Charlie, and then split up Brittany as a regnum, or a independent kingdom from the rest of France, which of course meant that at this time, the old Carolingian massive Western European empire consisted of a Western Francia utterly weakened by Viking raids and internal rebellion, and with a king who have just lost 2 major wars in a single year. Brittany, allied to a certain degree with various Viking tribes, but also of course being plundered by them. Lotharingia, who of course extended from the North Sea all the way down to Rome, which made it fairly ungovernable at the best of times simply because of the extent of space people needed to travel, and Central Germany, who had basically just seen its entire northern part be utterly annihilated by a bunch of hairy northern dudes. Yeah, 845. Not a good year for the Carolingians. After 845, things changed somewhat over the next couple of years. The Viking raids didn't really decline, but they became less, shall we say, official in scope as the Vikings' interest for at least a short time switched to England and Ireland with the Great Heathen Army, and it in fact took almost 40 years before they returned to the Frankenlands in any real sort of numbers to become a major threat rather than an annoying pests that just kept plundering the various coastlands. I will again return to that either in my video about the Siege of Paris 845 or my video about the Carolingians overall. But yeah, that was the year 845 as it pertains to the Carolingians and the Vikings. Not a good year if you were French or German, a very good year if you happen to be Scandinavian. So, you know, on behalf of all of us up here, yay, go us. We are good at plundering, burning, killing, torturing, and raping people. What an accomplishment.
Well, that was it. The year 845 in Western Europe. There are, of course, other things I could talk about, but in my opinion, these are the ones I have alluded to so much that I really wanted to make an actual video about it. As I said, I will eventually get to a full video about the Carolingians, which is a subject of great interest of mine, and a subject which is, of course, almost, well, you really can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand the Carolingian Empire if you want to understand why Europe developed in the way, shape, and form that it actually did. But that's for another time. For now, I hope you enjoyed this little video that basically described how a bunch of annoying bearded Northmen killed a lot of people. So on a happy note, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.